Shabbat shalom. I have a confession to make. I love fishing. But more than I love fishing, I love beating Solomon at fishing. Ever since our very first fishing trip together, I have always managed to catch more fish and better fish than Solomon. From the beginning, he joked that I had an advantage. He said the fish were looking for a spiritual connection. And whenever we'd go out, he would always joke with the crusty old boat hands about his wife, the rabbi, who catches more fish and better fish than he, even though she has only been fishing for a few seasons now. But all that changed on our recent trip to Canada. We decided to take a cod fishing trip out of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. And it started out like any other fishing trip. We're on the boat, we're joking about how long it's going to take me to catch my first fish. And then we get out there, we sink our lines down. There's nothing. My line is quiet and still. Meanwhile, Solomon is catching fish like there's no tomorrow. Within short order, he's pulled up enough fish to feed all 12 friends we're visiting that night. And then he starts asking around, anybody want a fish? Oh, a really big cod. Do you want this one? Do you want a fish? He quickly became the most popular person on the boat, and I quickly became the world's worst sport. Up until that point, I had not realized how much of my love of fishing had to do with my luck in fishing. Also, up until that point, I hadn't thought it was luck. I just figured I was a superior huntress. That all those years of knitting and piano had made my fingertips just so much more sensitive. I thought I had an intuitive connection to the fish. But there I was on this boat in Canada. I'm the same person, with the same skills, using the same strategies with the same track record, and I have a completely different result. The next day, I demanded that we go back out. Solomon joked that I couldn't stand him beating me. That was totally true. But also, I couldn't bear the thought of my abject failure. I mean, how do you go from being an epic fisherwoman to not being able to hook a single fish? Sadly for me, my luck did not improve the second day. And I was forced to confront a truth that I have avoided for some time. Isn't it interesting how our minds work? I mean, I know it is, right? So interesting. Just speaking personally, there was a certain craziness to my pre-Canada thinking. I mean, it is absurd, totally absurd, to think that you can just intuitively build a skill. That I could intuitively channel what I needed to learn in order to fish successfully. That's crazy. It was equally absurd to think that when I had initial success, that was anything but luck. How did I convince myself it was talent? And on the other hand, it's also absurd to think that my abject failure was anything but lack of talent. Why think it's bad luck? How is it that we so often think that our successes in life are due to our own skill, our own hard work, and so often blame our failures on external forces beyond our control? I think that's why our rabbis work so hard to change the narrative. Tisha B'Av is today. It's the holiday where we commemorate the loss of our temples and countless tragedies throughout Jewish history. It's a natural human response to tragedy, to shirk responsibility, to blame someone else. And for our rabbis, it would have been so easy to talk about how we were, what we were, a weaker military power in a time of power-hungry, angry, violent regimes. But that's not what they do. Our rabbis say that Tisha B'Av happened because of us, because of idolatry, because of adultery, because of bloodshed, because of sinat chinam, because of baseless hatred, because of our behavior. Our rabbis teach that we lost our temples because of what we did. And I think our rabbis doubled down on blame instead of thinking about external forces, because they want to counter that natural human instinct to shirk responsibility, to put the blame somewhere else. Our rabbis want to make sure that we don't miss out on the kind of introspection that could actually help us to improve our future. I want to share with you today a different reading. This is a teaching I learned just this year. It's a radically new read. If you look in the Talmud at Ta'anit 29a and Sota 35a, you'll see the rabbis give a very different explanation for Tisha B'Av. They don't blame it on any egregious sin. There's no adultery, idolatry, no bloodshed, no hatred. No, they put it on something seemingly way more benign. Do you remember that whole episode with the spies? Moses brings the people out of Egypt, gets them all the way up until the promised land. God's there. God's like, I'm with you. I'm going to make it. You're going to make it. Just go in. You're going to conquer the land. And the people are terrified. They're so filled with fear, they can't even imagine, so they decide to send spies. And when those emissaries come back and fan their fears, the people are apparently so bereft, they start weeping. They're so filled with fear and negativity that they're ugly crying. They can't stop. They're just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, and God gets so irritated. God says something to the effect of, I'll give you something to cry about. Atem bechitem bechia shel chinam ve'ani koveh lechem bechia ledorot. God says to them, you're crying baseless tears. I'm going to establish for you a day of crying for the generations. It's not God's most compassionate moment for sure. Certainly not how we want God to respond to our tears. But there's something really powerful in God's message here. God is saying to the people, if you're going to be so negative, if you're going to be so full of fear, if you're going to just see the horrible possibilities on the horizon, you are going to create that. You have a power within you to determine your destiny to an extent. You're going to be just like your ancestors. But if you can manage to shift your perspective, to keep your hearts open to new possibilities, then you might have a different result. Tisha B'Av is that reminder. Because the truth is, all of life is a dance between luck and skill. None of us are all powerful. None of us, no matter how many resources you have, no matter what skills you have, no matter where you are, no matter who your parents are, none of us controls what happens to us. And none of us are either plagued by complete bad luck. All of life is a dance of perspective. How do you dodge those curveballs that get thrown your way? How do you proceed when you've been cut down by loss, by dashed expectations, by failure? How do you keep your heart open to new possibilities? Towards the end of World War II, Israel, which was then called Palestine, was under British control. And the British at that time were trying to quell tensions between Arabs and Jews in the land, and were also trying to appease nearby Arab nations. And so they had put an end to Jewish immigration to Israel at a time when we needed it most desperately. They also forced new Jewish immigrants to live in these horrible, sex-segregated barracks in Atlit that resembled the concentration camps so many of them had just fled in Eastern Europe. Now, if you're a Jew living in the late 40s in Israel, you gotta be thinking, it doesn't matter. Whether you live in Egypt or Eastern Europe, or if you make it to the Promised Land, it doesn't matter. They're just gonna lock us up. They're just gonna keep us here, and we're never gonna have power. We're never gonna have autonomy. Our lives are just destined for suffering. But they didn't do that. They managed to overcome that picture, to hold on to the possibility, that their luck could turn, and they were determined to use their skills to make that happen. They created these amazing bullet factories underneath the laundry room floors of nearby kibbutzim. They were wily. They figured out how to bomb the train tracks and how to disrupt British plans. They snuck in and rescued those immigrants from those camps where they had been held. And that meant when the partition plan was accepted, they were able to declare independence. And that meant that the day after they declared independence, when 5 Arab nations attacked them at the same time, they had the resources and the training and the skills to make possible a miracle that Jews had only ever dreamed about before. That wasn't just about luck, though there was some of that too. That came about because our ancestors knew how to dance the dance of life. They knew how to keep their hearts open to possibility. They knew how to have hope, and they knew to put in the hard work to realize their dreams. The lesson of Tisha B'Av and the lesson of life is one and the same, and it's simple. Life is not just about luck, and life is not just about skill. Life is all about perspective. Shabbat Shalom.